Right.
There we go.
Terrific. Okay, I might kick off. Well, welcome to our inaugural Talking with Authors tonight. A small but perfectly formed group is here, and I'm very happy about that. And as I said previously, we will be recording this, so we'll be able to see how it travels. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Gadigal country of the Eora Nation. This is country that was never ceded. This is stolen land, and I pay my respects to past, present, and emerging leadership, and hope that they can actually steer us a bit better in the right direction, because we're not doing a tremendously good job so far. Tonight, I'm Julie Macken. My background is I was at the Financial Review for many years. I was then worked with Federal Labor. I worked with the New South Wales Greens. I've worked with Greenpeace, ActionAid, and I'm currently at the Justice and Peace Office. And I have just got my doctorate from Western Sydney and published a book myself. So I am very happy to be here. I'm particularly happy because the book is perfectly timed for a time of really high conflict and a great deal of uncertainty. So I don't think I actually need to introduce you for anyone here because I think we all know you and know your work. But in the interests of knowing that we're recording this, I will actually introduce you. Albert Palazzo is an adjunct professor at UNSW Canberra in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. He was formerly the really long-serving Director of War Studies for the Australian Army and completed his PhD in military history at the Ohio University and published his dissertation as Seeking Victory on the Western Front, the British Army and Chemical Warfare. He was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, emigrated to Australia in '96 and commenced his career in the School of History at the Australian Defence Force Academy. Gosh, Al, you have written more than 20 books and monographs on the art of war. And tonight we are discussing your most recent book, The Big Fix, Rebuilding Australia's Security. So welcome, Al. I'm really glad you are the first cab off the rank.
Well, Julie, happy to be here. Always happy to talk about these subjects.
Great. Well, we might just get right into it. It seems to me that The Big Fix has got kind of three big ideas in it. It's big ideas, not a particularly big book. But the three big ideas that I'd like us to start with, or particularly two of them, we'll get to the third later, I hope, is that we are actually, we have a defence position that is inadequate to the primary threat to Australia, and I'd really like you to talk about that. And that we have got a defence position that is entirely dependent on the kindness of strangers in many ways. It's a position of dependency. So if we could first start with you talking about what you think the actual threat is to our national security, before going on to this pretty humiliating defence position we have.
Yes, well, for me, and it's quite clear that the real threat to Australia and also to all of humanity is climate change. This is the big event that's coming down, and it's already begun. It's only going to get worse, and it's unavoidable because we've changed the atmosphere. And when you add heat to the system reacts. And so we're entering into a new world in which humanity will have a challenge in order to continue to survive and for people to continue to live. So that has to be the big threat. There's no other way to look at this. Particularly if you extend your definition of national security to mean something other than being attacked by another state.
Can you elaborate on that? What would, if you were able to define national security in its most fulsome way, how would you describe it? What would it take into account?
Well, it would take in many different factors, and basically anything that is contrary to the health and welfare of the Australian people. So it includes climate change, but it also includes things like growing wealth inequality between the boomer generation, of which I am one, and my children's generation and my grandson's generation, where we see the wealth disparity becoming institutionalized in Australian society. And you could also look at differences between the way we continue to treat the First Peoples across Australia. Sure, we they're now citizens and they have equal rights, but we continue to be unable to do a simple thing like say we're sorry. And so that is a fissure within society, which cannot have anything other than a negative effect. And so you can look at other aspects of society too, like a decreasing investment in a higher education as our universities wither. The ability of research to be conducted, which would provide breakthroughs, which could set a new foundation for Australia's wealth, or just lead to discoveries which would just assist with the well-being of people. Now, that is becoming harder and harder to do because we don't value, or not we, let's just say the government doesn't value investment in thinking. So if you take a broader picture of national security, you end up with different priorities. But unfortunately, our government and a lot of the defense commentariat insist that security is vis-a-vis another state.
Yeah.
And I think that's clearly nonsense. I don't think it's ever been the case, but I think it's particularly nonsense now when you have something like climate change staring you in the face, and you don't include that in national security policy, or you give it the briefest of mention, and then go on to wax lyrically about the threat of China.
So just before we move on to the threat of China, do you think, a couple of weeks ago, the government released half of the report on climate change impacts in Australia? And we'll talk about the missing other half, hopefully, if we have time later. Do you think, when the general public read the newspaper and find out that they're referring to climate change as dire, grim, quite a scary scenario in a relatively short time frame too, do you think that puts any kind of pressure at all on defense's thinking?
Well, defense is, the way defense thinks is that it will follow the government's lead. In that sense, the people who command the Department of Defense, both the military and the civilians, all the way down to the ordinary, private, they're a directed organization, and they won't take any action. They may think about it on a personal level, but on an institutional level, they won't address climate change until the government tells them this is your priority. And right now, the government is telling them their priority is China and working with the Americans. And so they're focusing in on that.
I had a small experience of that. I'm in the RFS, and we were fighting the 2019 fires, and we were exhausted, and the Prime Minister had managed to get back from his holiday briefly. And then he sent the Army Reserves to kind of help us out. And it was such a disaster. I really felt for these young guys, because they'd turn up, on the fire lines and just get underfoot, not know what to do. So in the end, we just asked them to help the women who were preparing food, which they were fine to do. But I thought, if this is our best, like these poor kids had no idea what they were doing there. And there was also no communication between the RFS and defence, I think has became obvious.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And I'm pretty confident that their commanders who directed them to do this understood that the ADF's presence was largely an announcement or a photo opportunity for the government to say that, we're doing stuff here now, we're taking action, we're sending in the military.
Yeah.
But there's in no circumstances is an infantry person or an artillery person, person who drives a tank for their living, qualified as a firefighter. Being a firefighter is a pretty skilled job too, and soldiers are just not designed for that. And as I mentioned to you, and I've mentioned to other people, I mean, in all the soldiers I've met and all the sailors and aviators I've encountered over the years, not a single one has ever told me that they joined the ADF to put out fires.
Yeah, it's shocking.
Just not why they're there.
Yeah, that's right. Well, as we found out, that's probably quite
just
lucky.
A misuse of resources, because the government felt the need to be seen doing something.
Yeah. So let's get on to what the government thinks of as our primary threat, and how that informs, I guess, funding. Well,
the government doesn't initially work through what's the threat. First, they have to understand, or first they try to understand, what is the United States doing? What does the United States see as the primary activity or responsibility in the Western Pacific, in our part of the world? And when the government understands that, then they can propose, options for what Australia should be doing. And this is the essence of dependency that we've had on the United States since the APSF alliance in 1951. The United States doesn't really ever come to us and say, this is what you need to do. We sort of figure out what is something that we could do that would keep the Americans, happy or on side. And then we push that. And that's why we invited ourselves to Vietnam. The Americans, didn't really need us there. What we sent was a trivial force element, brigade-sized element. We did stuff. But what we mainly did was, make sure the Australian flag was always visible, and we had a presence in American headquarters. So we constantly keep reminding them of how loyal an ally Australia is.
And we do that because, and you speak a lot about this in The Big Fix. And as an Australian, every time you spoke about it, I got even more embarrassed than the last time. But you talk about this really quite pathetic level of dependency that we've had since colonisation, where first it was the motherland, and then when we realised, they're not up for it anymore, they kind of, as far as they could, booted us out of home. We very quickly became dependent on the US as the country that's going to protect us.
Yes.
Labor in opposition, I was, there were big arguments going on, and this was back in 2006. So a long time ago, when the world was very young, there were arguments going on internally about, if Labor ever comes to power after John Howard, should the relationship stay the same, or should we get up and stand on our own 2 feet like a real live nation might? And the response was always, don't be ridiculous, because if we do that, we'll have to spend 3 to 4 to 5% of GDP on defence, and no one will like us, because all of that money that could be going on hospitals and childcare and all the rest will be going on defence. So it's economic, not just strategic, it's economic for us to be entirely dependent on the US. Do you think that argument had any currency, or has?
Well, it was certainly the argument that they made. But also, I don't think it's an argument that actually holds up to any analysis, because the first thing you should ask is, okay, we're spending X% of GDP on military matters. What are we protecting ourselves from? And frankly, in 2006, even before, in the 1990s, the 1980s, doesn't matter when, Australia has always been pretty safe. There really hasn't been a threat to the nation. There have been, points where you should, actually worry a little bit. And we have a long history of invasion scares where the French are coming, the Russians were coming, the Americans were coming, the Chinese, the Japanese. You pick any country, at some point, they were going to attack Australia. And of course, none of it was true. It was all a perception of fear. And if I have, to identify, the one consistent thread in the mentality of our political class, I would say it's fear. They operate out of fear that something that's not going to happen is going to happen. And that's why we turn to the Americans to protect us from something from a threat that doesn't exist. I mean, I don't know what they say in Beijing. I'm not a Chinese scholar, and I don't understand their languages. But they must be very puzzled by the extent to which Australia is afraid of China.
Yeah.
I don't get it. It is a struggle to understand this, but fear does seem to be the consistent driver in Australian foreign policy.
Yeah.
Julie,
It's a very...
could you invite Mark perhaps to comment on that point? He is a Chinese scholar.
Ah!
Well, that's very flattering of you to say so, Ross. That's not strictly true. I mean, I go to China quite a bit and got lots of Chinese pals, but I'm ashamed to say I don't speak the language, and that's a bit of a handicap. But I think a lot of people in China, if they think about Australia at all, which isn't that much, I think it's one thing to recognise, we're just not that important to China in many ways. But it would be handy if we were friendlier, if we were less wedded to the United States from a Chinese perspective. I think they think that was a good result. But generally, I don't think they're holding their breath, because they do think that we're wedded to the United States. They do think that we're sort of running dogs and all the rest of it. And so they're not, I don't think there are any great expectations about us doing anything out of the ordinary or out of the kind of historical pattern that we have done for ages. So I don't think there's great expectations in China, and that says more about us than it does about them, I think.
Mm. And also, I mean, this anxiety, and I think it is a legacy of, my book argues that anxiety is a legacy of disavowed violence in our colonization. So we're kind of running scared of being revealed to ourselves in a lot of ways. But it's a very expensive anxiety. It's extreme right now, and perhaps we could talk about that. This anxiety of ours is going to cost us at least $400 billion for some submarines that won't turn up at some point in the future. Like, that's an expensive neurosis we've got going on.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we'll probably spend at least $50 billion before we get word that they're not coming. And that's money you just won't get back. But in the meantime, we would have then provided the United States with a submarine base on our west coast, in addition to the Air Force base we're providing them in Northern Territory. So, we're spending money for nothing tangible, and the U.S. is not spending money and getting something very tangible, very important. So, you can't really fault the people in Washington for taking advantage of us. If we're silly enough to allow this to happen, well, this is how states operate. They'll take advantage of us, and they'll keep doing it until we wise up.
We're also building Britain's clapped out shipyards anew. So it's not all going to the US. There's a remnant of...
Yes. We're tossing them a few billion too.
Yeah, very much so. Can we just have a look at happens, like who know, quite frankly, right now, who knows what is going to happen? Like this bizarre situation where we're begging America to take our dollars for nothing in return, and we're just hoping they will take our money. Like this is off the charts when it, for a failure of logic, if nothing else. But
yes, both a failure of logic and a failure of politics, and perhaps most significantly, a failure of honesty to the Australian people. I mean, they're supposed to represent our interests, our political class, but they're not doing that in the slightest. They seem quite content to represent perhaps their own personal interests, but not actually represent the interests of the country in this particular deal.
But as you said, America is getting a lot out of this. They're going to have West Australia, they're going to have Darwin, they're going to have listening all up and down the country, so that if there is ever conflict between China and the US, before there is conflict between China and the US, China will take out huge parts of Australia as a way of kind of getting America to the negotiating table and as a way of blinding America.
Yes, I mean, that is, I would say, a fairly likely, but not absolute scenario, that, the reason why it'd be better for China to target Australia is that, it's a very soft demonstration target. And so you take out chunks of Australia, whereas if they targeted American assets direct, that might get a different reaction.
Yeah.
And so the US may not react with maximum, violence to an attack upon Darwin. Some Americans would die and a lot of Australians would die, but it may not be the same thing as, Guam being obliterated, or Okinawa being obliterated, or even an attack on, Pearl Harbor itself, onto sovereign American territory. So with the Japanese, if the Chinese were thinking this through, it's not unreasonable to target Australia first, or at least in the initial attack.
So we're spending vast amounts of money in what can only be seen internationally as a humiliating position of dependency in order to put Australia at high risk of a conflict that, in fact, we need not have anything to do with. The option of actually not becoming embroiled in this is on the table. So the stakes are enormously high for us, and yet they're given the stakes financially and every other way. Have you got any thoughts on why everyone is not talking about this down at the pub?
Well, we invited ourselves to Vietnam. We invited ourselves to Iraq. We invited ourselves to Afghanistan, places that were not in our area of interest and that we could have avoided. And yet, the political class, although with Iraq, labor objected to that, but most of the political class and most of the commentariat were all in for those things. And I think there's a number of reasons there. And one is perhaps, the first is perhaps the most upsetting. But Australia, our political commentariat classes, they follow this long-established automatic dependency because it's just easy. I mean, it's terrible to say it that way, and perhaps it reflects upon our laziness as a thinking population, but it's basically lazy. You get to have the assurance of defense, or the illusion of defense, without having to do anything other than spending some money and join in a bit of wars here and there. But the situation is now different. Iraq was a fourth-rate country. Afghanistan wasn't a country. There was no danger to Australia. But now we're inviting ourselves to a war with China. This is madness, because this cannot end well. for anybody. And we need to also remember, and I wish the political class would become cognizant of this. China is a nuclear armed power. You cannot encourage wars between nuclear armed powers because it ends badly. At least I imagine it will end badly. We don't know yet, but this may be the first occasion
where it ends.
So,
well, particularly with silly discussions about, nuclear bombs that are usable without blowing everyone to pieces. The idea
yes.
that we're developing these sweet little nuclear bombs that are very clever and only blow up certain areas. So there's no need to launch the over 2,000 nuclear warheads across the world. That's
Yes,
what
that
I
is
find very dangerous.
That is like a fingers crossed defense policy, where you're hoping that the other guy won't do what they probably will do.
Yeah, what they've already said they will do.
So
this is extremely depressing, but you have come up with two things that I think are really interesting. A call out for Australia to develop a grand strategy for defence that would then inform a lot of our positioning, like would we become an offensive army or a defensive army? Can you talk a bit about when you're talking grand strategy, what are you including in that?
Well, when I say grand strategy, I don't mean just defense. A grand strategy encompasses all the levers of government power and even non-government levers. But the first essence or the first requirement of a grand strategy is the nation, not just the politicians, but the nation needs to put down a marker. What does Australia want to be in 10, 20, 30, 50 years? What kind of nation does Australia want to be? Now, people marvel at how quickly China is advancing, both militarily and in other aspects of their economy. The main reason, or one of the reasons, is that they have a plan, right? They developed a plan decades ago and updated it periodically, and they're sticking to this plan as they create the China that they envision. Now, we may not like that China, but it's their country. And so we need to have a plan for us. And then when you come up with that goal, this is what we want to be, you then can start allocating the different levers, whether it's diplomacy, whether it's economics, whether it's different, even the most minor of government departments would have a role in it. Defense is just one player among many. And I would argue it's not the most important. For me, the most important the government lever of power is foreign affairs. That is where we should really be investing in. Cancel one of the subs, use that money to reinvigorate foreign affairs, and actually start engaging with the region to become a part of the region instead of always leaning towards the Anglosphere. Let's become part of the region and part of the Asia Pacific. And if we can pull that off, that is a big way to improve our security. It's a much better way.
This is all very Keating-esque, I have to say, Al. You
must have read my book.
It's very Australia 1980s, first half of 1990s, where the call out for us was, to cut the apron strings, understand reality that we're in Asia, and build our relationships, with APEC and the like. So it has a very 80s, 90s feel to it for me. But given the lack of political leadership that we currently have in Australia and the need for this, where possibly could the voices, the drivers for this, who do we want to be when we grow up conversation come from?
Yes, and this is one of the things that just drives me mad about most of my compatriots in the national security commentariat, because most of them are still as wedded to the United States line as the government is. And so the government is not being challenged. It's not being challenged by the Labor Liberal Party because they're as one with the United States, and it's not being challenged by external people either. There are a few journalists who argue against maintaining such a close relationship with the United States, but it's very much at the scattered individual level. And that's why I hope organizations like the Australian Peace and Security Forum or IPAN can gain greater traction, and the government will start to realize that perhaps there is another way. Perhaps they can actually think and come up with different policies to provide for security.
Do you think Donald Trump will help that discussion move along?
Yeah, Donald Trump has been helping quite a lot. I noted that one of the tent pegs of the defense policy was that we had to support, we had to join with the Americans, support the global rules-based order. And in the last 6 months ago, they've barely mentioned the rules-based order. And that's because it's been one of Trump's, quickest victims. The rules-based order doesn't exist. And the United States is the country that took it apart, not China, the United States. And still, though, our political leaders don't twig to the issue that the United States doesn't really care about us. We're just useful idiots. And they'll just use us for as much as they can to get what they need. And I understand that. And that's fine, because that's what they do in their interests. But we as Australians should recognize that we have our interests too. And the interests of a country like us and the interests of the United States are not the same. We are geographically, we're economically, we're socially, culturally different. And our futures are different. So our interests have to be different. But for now, our government thinks, we're just, a subset.
A little. Before, I just want to ask one more question before we just throw it open to comments or questions. What would be your position on Australia adopting a position of armed neutrality?
I prefer to use the term, armed, sovereignty.
Okay.
I don't have a problem with that because I'm not calling for neutrality or, to become unarmed. To go the way of, some people say Costa Rica and you get rid of the military. No, I think Australia needs a military and probably a strong military or strong for our size. But we need a military that is designed to protect Australian interests. Right now, we have an Australian Defence Force that is not designed to fight in the nation's defense. It's designed to sail off or march off or fly off and help the Americans do something that the Americans need done. And then we get our flag alongside the American flag. It would be very helpful. And most countries, the Defense Force is meant to defend the country, and you design it around that principle. But that's not the case here. It's very, as a partial outsider, it's very, very strange.
Well, as an absolute insider, it is very, very strange. Maybe can we just open it up now for other people who have thoughts or questions? Fire away.
I'm happy to ask a question, make a couple of comments if nobody minds. I don't want to be a windbag, but I reviewed Al's book. I thought it was excellent. I don't know if people have seen it, but I thought it was an excellent book. The only serious diversion I thought from your points out was, as I'm sure you read the review, but I just think that identifying climate change is absolutely the right thing to do. No problem about that whatsoever. However, I think the buying into the idea and the discussion of what's an appropriate defence force for our particular needs, etc., etc. I can understand the logic of that. People will take you much more seriously than they do people like me, because you come from a background that understands the issues, understands that kind of perspective, and where those people are coming from. So I take all that as read. However, I just think it still risks downplaying the climate change problem, because that is the security issue. It seems to me, in my naivety, that if the international community, if there is such a thing, wanted to solve the Gaza crisis and stop the war in Ukraine, it should be possible, and it should be possible for it to happen reasonably quickly, given the right constellation of forces, arguments, and pressure. However, that's unlikely to happen when we're still dominated by a kind of particular discourse, way of thinking, and our understanding of collective reality. And I think the big challenge is to shift the way that we think about some of these issues in a fundamental manner. Because even if we did stop the war in Ukraine and Gaza, which is just a sort of luxuries we can't afford anymore, given the threat of climate change, we'd still have to get mobilized and do something about climate change. And I'm deeply pessimistic about our chances of that happening, partly because we still put forward the nation states, its interests, its defense needs, all of that kind of stuff as being the foremost problem that we all face collectively. And I just don't think that's an accurate assessment of where we are as a species these days. And until we start taking a more collective view of our collective destiny, I think we're doomed, personally. I hate to strike an even more pessimistic note, but I just cannot see how we're going to get out of this unless there's some really profound shift in thinking and a recognition that this is a collective problem that no individual state can fix. And we need to, Australia, sorry to go on about this, but Australia could set a good example of what you can do by radically reducing traditional ways of thinking about security and defense spending and doing something different. And we've got nothing to lose in that sense, because if we don't do that, we are stuffed. I mean, and Australia is one of the biggest contributors to the problem. So sorry about the little rant, but something I feel strongly about, as you can see. But there you go.
Yeah, I largely agree with you, Mark. And now that our first priority as the society or as a species should be to rapidly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, not to net zero, but way below net zero. Get rid of that net zero term. Just reduce it to zero as quickly as possible. And if you happen to be, the president or the CEO of a major, gas or coal or industry, well, retrain, do something else. Because, yeah, as a species, we're in a dire position. But I'm also a military historian. And, thinking about war just informed all my thinking. And, when we fail, and I think like you that we're likely going to fail, then, wars will break out, and they'll be driven by desperate people wanting to secure their basic needs. And the government will have to do something about that. And I think the best way to, sort of conceptualize this is that, remember when we had Somalia as an ungoverned space? That was just one part of the world in the Horn of Africa, fairly isolated. And imagine dozens of ungoverned spaces north and south of the equator as countries go underwater, some literally, some figuratively. And we may have to do something, and that something will involve military force. And so we need to start thinking about what do we need, how do we approach it, and what are we willing to do? Because that's also a moral question.
Yeah, but the problem is, how would you try to sell the idea that is in some ways, it's an understandable and a rational response in some ways to a declining international situation and climate change, refugees, and all the rest of it. But one of the reasons why the government finds it so hard to articulate a new and different kind of position, I think, is because that is such a sort of gloom-inducing scenario. Best case scenario, we're going to have a defensive military that will be able to shove all these climate change refugees back out to sea and keep us safe for a bit longer than everybody else. But it's still a completely hopeless vision, because we'll survive for a bit longer because we've got a bit of state capacity and we can shove all the refugees away. But the long-term situation, which is not that long-term anymore anyway.
Not anymore, no.
So, so the longer term is we're all kind of doomed. So unless we can shift that thinking and do something radically unprecedented for an unprecedented situation, I just think, you know, I don't know how you do that, how you get people to take that discourse seriously. I don't know. And your book is a major contribution, because you will be taken seriously because of your background and your understanding of the kind of inside view of those things. But how we shift from there, from where we are to where we want to be, I just don't know.
Is that
Yes, and unfortunately, I don't know how serious I'll be taking, because nobody from the government has contacted me yet about this book. Nobody from defense.
I don't think there's been a debate on defence in the Australian Parliament in recent years.
No, there hasn't. You know, the major parties are in lockstep.
Do you think, just Mark, going off that particularly positive projection into the future you just outlined, thanks very much.
For them, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that's why the Albanese government hasn't released the second half of the climate impact report, which goes to questions of intelligence? Because it would, you know, it does pose questions like, in 20 years' time, are we going to be willing to bomb a couple of 100,000 people in boats coming to Australia? Are we going to, what are we going to do about an archipelago above us that is now run by warlords? These are kind of questions where the government's better have a plan. If you're going to start talking about this, it's all right for us to shoot.
That's why nobody wants to talk about it. And I think the real problem, I think, is that some of the political leaders in this country, and every other country for that matter, of course, they still privilege the national interest above all else. They still are incapable of thinking about our collective destiny transcending national borders and having an obligation to try to do something for other people in much less fortunate situations who are going to become climate refugees before us. And there's no way you can sell this to you know, a democratic electorate or anybody, any other form of political constituency, I don't think. And that's one of the fundamental problems. And how you overcome that, and how you do get people to take those kinds of ideas much more seriously, is a really difficult question. And I think there's an ability to be able to sort of compartmentalize thinking about this, because, you know, Penny Wong and Albanese presumably aren't completely stupid or ignorant about the sort of possible dangers of the future, and that they're unwilling to take them seriously. So I think that's a really fundamental problem that we, you know, getting around that. I just don't know how you do it. But sorry, there's lots of other people want to ask you questions. Or
yeah, we've got 10 minutes left. Let's go Catherine, Russell, and then Michael.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks, Albert, for that very explanatory talk about your book. I've got it. I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to be reading it very soon. I'm on Bribie Island, so I make apologies for my late arrival here. I just did want to say I'm really interested and concerned about how we get to where we want to be. The US is now a rogue state, I believe. It doesn't care at all for international law. And I'm wondering whether, if we had independents and Greens having the balance of power, although not all the independents would be on the same page as us, I think, but possibly most of them would be. Maybe the others could be convinced, whether we would possibly be able to get some movement with that. That seems to me really the only way we'll get movement on our foreign policy.
Yeah, that would at least allow other ideas to be seriously considered. If the government actually had to negotiate with other parties like the Greens, or a constellation of independents, because right now, you know, particularly on security matters, with Labor and Liberal, you know, generally being aligned, things are far too easy for them, and so they don't really have to think hard about it. and they're able to push their agendas, which then don't get any serious scrutiny. And that's what a valid opposition should be doing, is scrutinizing and exposing to the Australian people other dimensions of the policy agenda.
Yes, I don't know why we keep getting the opposition speaking as if they are the opposition, when really the Greens and Independents have as much, if not more, support in the population.
Yep.
Russell?
I agree.
Thanks, Al, and thanks, Julie. Thank you for the presentation. It's sort of along the same lines as Catherine's questions. You've been around this game trying to influence thinking within Australia for some decades, as we heard at the beginning in the introduction. I'm puzzled why the commentariat is so uniform in its views. Is it because groups like ASPI and to some extent National Security College, they receive funding from DFAT? That's the determining factor for them. Why is it we don't have more public debate amongst the commentariat on these questions about Australia's security and the potential of a conflict with China? Everyone seems to think that, oh, that's good, we'll be with the US and we'll win, which I think is absolute nonsense.
Yeah, there are no winners there. I think you touched on, you sort of answered your own question. These people know who's got the money and they want a slice of it, and so they're very agreeable to not taking on the government's positions too harshly, and unfortunately that's something I've never suffered from, so but yeah, I think that it just comes down to friends and influence. And they're comfortable in that space.
Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, and thanks, Al. My thoughts on your book. I think it's just a fantastic contribution, and more power to you for writing it, and thank you very much. It really is a great book that will help the debate if we can get it started. And that's actually the problem, to get the debate started, because there is no debate at the moment. Even though the most important and most essential responsibility of every politician, of every elected representative, is the security and well-being of their electorate, on matters of national security, they have no say whatsoever. The way that national security is determined in this country is by national cabinet, and even they are sometimes only informed rather than debating major issues. Evidence for this is AUKUS, or most recent evidence is AUKUS. And I would say the treaty with Papua New Guinea and other Pacific states, which did not involve any, that I am aware of, public consultation or opinion gathering. So these decisions are made by a few. So the challenge is really, how do we change that? How do we get the Australian people involved in saying to their elected representatives, hey, it's your responsibility to debate these issues and you should be talking to us about them. And we now have some politicians on board, or ex-politicians on board, who I think are quite keen on this approach. Doug Cameron was mentioned in the prelude, and people like Bob Carr and all Labor people, actually. And we even have one who we met with last year, a coalition member who's calling for a national security policy, although his would be really a reflection of American national security rather than an Australian national security, in my view. Where your book really helps us, in my view, Al, is you've come up with the concept of the strategic defensive. which I think sits beautifully in the defence component of national security, because our current strategy of deterrence by denial is a totally, flawed strategy that can't be realised. But very few people, including military people, understand the strategic defensive. I think there's fertile ground for APSF to promote that and to develop that further. So that's one issue. The second issue is that China is now seen as the big threat, and everything that we are doing in national security is focused about China. And to put it in another way, about how we can show our support to the United States to contain China. And this is a flawed and dangerous strategy for the reasons that you've already discussed. I mean, we will be the first rather than the last target if war or ever occurs. And the Australian people are totally oblivious to this. When I say the Australian people, I'm talking about the majority. And we need to somehow try and get that message through. And I'm not anti-US. I'm actually pro-US. But when we go to wars of choice, such as in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and Korea, even before that, those wars of choice had very minimal impact on the future of Australia's physical security, right? The strategy really wasn't about supporting those countries. It's about supporting the United States.
Yeah,
now we're in a different domain. If you're taking on China, hey, come on, this is very different. And we have to call that out for what it is. Now, how do we mobilize public opinion? That's the bottom line. And in my thinking, AUKUS is still the best way to try and mobilize public opinion, because it gives us a demonstrable example of something which is totally fallacious. And particularly in supporting a country that's totally abandoned the so-called rules-based international order, the United States. So yeah. Anyway, I could talk a bit about the concept of armed neutrality, which I don't think is really for us, Julie, but I think much of the essence of armed neutrality is fine. But when we talk about treaties, as we're all doing now about the Papua New Guinea Puk Puk Treaty, we actually have a treaty that we're not doing much about, and that's the Treaty of Rarotonga. The nuclear-free and peace zone in our north, and all of our efforts should be saying, how do we cooperate with our neighbours to ensure the Treaty of Rarotonga is honoured and lives? And defence has a part to play in that, not the only part, but it has an important part. And soon as you put defence strategy as the euphemism for national security strategy, what we do all the time is say, the debate between Defence of Australia or expeditionary force and forward defence. That becomes the big debate. And that's the debate we shouldn't be having. The debate we should be having is about how do we ensure our national security for future generations of Australians. And so we've got to look at how do we promote that within the community, and how do we partner with other civil society organisations, and how do we put pressure on our parliamentarians to really, really live up to their prime responsibility. There's no consultation on these matters. We're just informed about them. Sorry, that's a bit of...
That's all right. No, that's perfectly all right. Clearly, the next webinar we need to have is a very big coalition of people talking about how we build a people's national security plan for Australia. So, you know, stay tuned for how we put that little baby together. Ian, sorry.
Yes, well, again, my thanks for inviting me to this, the first meeting, and to hearing from Al about his book. I'm reminded in this discussion of where I grew up as a boy, which was in Williamstown in Melbourne. And I used to play in concrete bunkers at the water's edge, which were built by the then Victorian government during the Crimean War, because the fear was that Russian naval vessels would sail through the heads into Port Phillip Bay. And all round the bay to this day, starting at Portsea, there are those concrete bunkers. They're still there, so they could fire on Russian men of war. Fast forward to the 1960s, out from Alice Springs, I walked out to Pine Gap, which is absolutely integral to Australia's reliance on great and powerful friends. Add to that the Northwest Cape. Now we've got HMAS Sterling, pardon me, and what's happening in Darwin. There is, in fact, quite a lively debate about defence policy. We have Hugh White's books that he's written, and he's spoken extensively to many audiences about his belief, and which is well documented, that for defence, a la the South China Sea and the East China Sea, in nuclear-powered submarines, is not the way Australia should be defending ourselves. We should be having a completely different defence posture. And of course, you've mentioned Bob Carr and Gareth Evans and Keating have all come out strongly critical. And I suspect within the ALP, there are many muted voices who are very unhappy about this entering this submarine alliance, $368 billion, which we're told has built into it some slack to cover over expenditure. How much, I don't know, and whether we ever see it. Of course, the litmus test for all of this will be Taiwan. If, as Deng Xiaoping has committed the country to, and he wasn't the first, by any shot, the Chinese have long been committed to recovering Taiwan into the homeland. A very difficult military undertaking. Whether they do it directly, and Deng Xiaoping has said 2027 it'll come back, or slowly bit by bit, we don't know. And if the Americans don't respond, then that's the great wake-up call for Australia. That will result in a radical rethink of what we need to do. Perhaps people are thinking about that now, and whether our 3 submarines make any difference, if we ever receive them, as we're saying, I would think is very doubtful. I mean, what's America have? Well, over 60, 70 nuclear-powered submarines, nuclear armed, I can't recall the exact number. So it's hard to think, because only one would ever be actively engaged at any one time. Others will be in maintenance, dry dock or whatever, others will be elsewhere. So perhaps it's the equivalent of those concrete bunkers around Port Phillip Bay for an eventuality that may or may not occur, and for which the bunkers made 0 difference.
That's great, Ian. Thank you so much. I'm just checking time, and I realise we've gone over, but Adrian, you had your hand up last of all. Let's finish with you.
Oh, thanks, Julie. Sorry, Al, I haven't read your book, but I look forward to getting it. I was interested in your in your commentary about the grand strategy, and one of the things that I was in a meeting on conflict prevention that DFAT hosted in a sort of a roundtable in Canberra about a month ago, and when I was asked what should we do, I said we'll start by doubling DFAT. And I certainly heard you speaking on diplomacy. I was in UN headquarters about 15 years ago when actually a Bolton-appointed Cold War warrior American Undersecretary General for Political Affairs, who turned out to be an absolute a sort of dream run for us, because he made a pitch for a stronger political department against peacekeeping, basically. And what I find interesting in a lot of the debate, and the Secretary General's had this for years, and I feel like this is an echo in Australia, is that DFAT always gets this: do it within existing resources. Climate change, do it within existing resources. Cyber threat, do it within existing resources. Merge AusAid, and in fact, then the budget continued to decrease. So I'm really interested if you've got thoughts on countries that have done that, have gone in the direction where it's not just defence, and defence is the answer to everything, but where the sort of doubling DFAT, the heading towards conflict prevention, preventive diplomacy, where relationships and sort of soft power and qualitative things versus big metal chunks of steel that go underwater, the debate becomes broader, and that we can perhaps contribute to broadening it.
I'm actually not sure, Adrian. It's something I'll need to think about, or take the question and think about it. There must be some countries out there that are reinforcing their diplomatic initiatives as opposed to their military ones. Yeah, I'm going to have to puzzle on that one, Adrian, but thank you for asking it.
We are out of time.
Julie,
This, yep.
Before you go, can I just briefly do a bit of self-promotion? This is
Sure.
new book, Half the Press, which you may or may not want to get a copy of. But we're having a book launch in Melbourne and a book launch in Sydney. So if any of you live in either of those towns and want to come along, this will be a chance for a bit of ranting about AUKUS. And it's called The Search for Security, AUKUS and the New Militarism. So it's an edited book, but it's got some great contributions, not by me, but by some other people. But no, it's good. So if anybody wants to come along to the launches, send me an email, I'll let you know when they're on.
Terrific, Mark. Maybe we could just do an email blast through the whole membership for that.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. As I said at the beginning, we are small and perfectly formed. It is really clear to me that there is a space for APSF to actually really step up and build a coalition of other like-minded organisations, ideally some with big bucks as well, to actually prosecute the argument for a human and national security plan for Australia. I think people are highly alarmed. There is clearly a great deal of slippage happening internationally. We're aware the international order is, it's coming apart like a wet cigar. It is absolutely time for us to look to our own security and use this emergent anxiety that we have and put it in harness to a good outcome for Australia. So, like, maybe we can have more discussions about how we do that and who is in that coalition, because I have a dreadful sense that we're running out of time. Al, thank you so much for your generosity and for the book. And we will do everything we can in our own way to make sure it gets in front of people who should be reading it.
Yes, thank you, Julie, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks. Good night,
Night,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.